Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's special episode of SCV Chat. I'm your host, George Connor Bond, here with MDS and the producer as usual. We also have two special guests with us. We have one who will be joining us a little bit later, Mr. Ryan Walters. Hopefully, he'll be joining in on the chat. And we also have Carl Jones. Now, today is a very special day in America. Today is Constitution Day, September 17th. I can't remember exactly what year in the 1700s that it was ratified, but or not ratified, but came out of the convention. The Constitution came out of the Philadelphia Convention, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But before we get into that, we're going to go through our normal stuff. Let me give our normal disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed on this show are not necessarily the views and opinions of the National SCV, any division, camp, or brigade, or any other subsidiary. They're the views and opinions specifically of those who are saying it, so draw it as you will. So good evening, everyone, and happy Constitution Day to you.
Hello.
Constitution Day.
Yeah. I imagine that tonight's episode is going to be one of our better episodes. I hope everybody has had a great week. Starting it later, we wanted to do it actually on the day. So let's go ahead and jump into a little bit of SCV news before we jump right into the topic. MDS, you'd mentioned that you saw a report coming out of the Commonwealth of Virginia about the Stonewall Jackson Monument, I believe in Richmond. You want to expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I guess the private proposal sent to the City Hall calls for the cutting of the Stonewall Jackson Confederate statue or other into pieces, and proceeds from that sale would be sent to Richmond School. So they want to cut the statue apart and sell pieces of it to celebrate them being a bunch of damn Marxists.
So not only, we've discussed it, especially in our cancel culture episode, how these people are saying that, it needs to be moved to a cemetery, it needs to be moved to a museum, so it can be properly contextualized. Well, we clearly see now that that is a lie. They're wanting to essentially draw and quarter Stonewall Jackson and sell them off, which is a crying shame. I'm sure somebody within the Confederation or somebody in the South would prefer to buy them whole, like that golf course did for the Robert E. Lee statue in Texas. So that's that. As it continues on, we'll continue to monitoring and bring more information on it. Anybody else have any news around the Confederation they've seen?
Oh, hey, we're moving stuff into the museum.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot to ask for the museum update. Did we finish the Jeff Davis install?
The pedestal's up. We're just waiting to put President Davis back on his pedestal. And then understand there's going to be an unveiling on the 10th of October. So
that'll be nice. That'll be really nice. I'm glad y'all are starting to move into the museum, just so that we can, I can start hiding those pictures of my daguerreotype around and see if y'all can figure out which is the real Confederate soldier and which one's a picture of me. So at this point, we normally have AS with us, and he gives us a little word of wisdom, but he's not in this week. He has to sit out. So we're going to skip over that and run right into trivia. So this week, as we mentioned, it's Constitution Day, and we're talking about the Constitution. But the Confederate Constitution and the Federal Constitution, as well as may dive into some constitutional, not so much theory, but constitutional history in America, state constitutions. We might get into that, we might not. Anything and everything you can imagine Constitution we're going to do. But for this week's trivia question, out of the 7 original seceding states that are listed in the Confederate Constitution, which state had the largest representation in the House of in the House of Representatives, according to the Confederate Constitution?
Who are you asking?
Oh well, so we have we're right now live streaming on Twitch, and anybody who is watching on the page, we open up the comments at this point and we allow them to chime in and answer. Sometimes somebody gets it right, sometimes they don't. This week, probably no one's going to get it. But if you would like to answer it, Carl, you sure can.
No, I'll wait. I mean, I can make a guess at it. I can tell you who had the smallest.
Well, yeah. Smallest was Florida.
Yeah. That's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
I would have to say
really
South
did.
Carolina.
Interesting you say that.
Yeah, I'd either say South Carolina or Mississippi, one of the two.
Mississippi had one more than South Carolina did, but Mississippi did not have the most.
Virginia.
Georgia.
Virginia was not in the originals.
Oh, you're talking about the original 7?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Original 7. Hey,
Georgia.
good to see you,
hey,
Ron.
Hmm?
Good to see you. You snuck in on us.
I snuck in.
Yeah.
Of the
Yeah,
original 7, I'm going to say Georgia.
Yeah, that's it. Georgia.
Ah,
Georgia had 10 representative votes in the Confederate Constitution.
Empire State of the South.
that
I don't
makes
know if that's
sense.
claiming
That makes sense now that you say it. That wouldn't have come to mind. I would have thought South Carolina simply because the length of time that they'd been around, but been populated as well. So
Right.
Well, I mean,
well,
Georgia's a penal colony, so they definitely have more people.
now we understand your ancestry.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Before we dive into the topic, I do want to remind everybody in the chat who's watching, anybody who watches later, we are still doing our historic Elm Springs National Confederate Museum giveaway. Great bunch of swag. We're just giving away to somebody. All you have to do is just email. I believe it's youth. Harrison, what's the email address?
SCV Youth Outreach at gmail.com.
Yeah, that's the producer's email. So all you have to do is just email, send us your address, where you're from. Well, of course, it's in your address. Your T-shirt size and things like that. We're giving away a T-shirt, a challenge coin, a coffee mug, and a commemorative cup from the 2012 National Reunion, and probably some other stuff. So y'all email that in. We'll be doing the drawing whenever we do the episode on the museum up at Elm Springs. So before we dive really into the topic, one last thing. I want to ask our two guests, Carl and Ron, if y'all wouldn't mind introducing yourself to the chat and tell us a little bit about yourselves.
I'll defer to Ron. Age before beauty.
All right. I'll go first. If you want me to go first, no problem.
Yeah, go on.
Okay. My name's Ryan Walters. I'm living in North Texas. I'm an adjunct history professor at Collin College. There's multiple campuses. I'm at the Wiley, Texas campus, which unfortunately now is all online because of all of this craziness. But I'm the book review editor for the Abbeville Institute, and I do occasional lectures and things for Abbeville. And I'm have a writing contract with Regnery Publishing, as well as some books coming out from Abbeville and from Shotwell Publishing. So I teach and write history.
Well, I love the Institute. Usually, eventually we're going to do an episode on Lincoln, and 90% of the information I got on him was off the Institute. The other 10% was from Lorenzo. So I'm glad to have somebody from the Institute here to speak with us today. Which I know Carl's written a couple of articles for the Institute, but Carl's articles are I have to read them in his voice in order for them to make sense.
I don't know what to
All
say
right,
about that.
Just say thank you.
Pretty spot on.
So Carl, introduce yourself to the audience.
I'm Carl.
Okay.
That's going right. Thank you.
That is right up there with thank you. That's beautiful.
I thought I'd trip Connor up by just playing off of my acceptance speech.
You did. You got me chuckling. You got me chuckling good. So really quickly to dive into some of the stuff. Well, we in our normal warm up, we kind of brought this up. And speaking to you, Carl, a couple weeks ago, I was taking a course from Hillsdale College. They're one of the free online courses. I'm not plugging them, just saying what I was doing on the Federalist Papers. And you told me to really understand the Constitution, I needed to read the Federalist Papers and get into the mind of the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist, as well as read more information on the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention. So if you and Ryan want to talk about the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist, whatever you want to, I kind of want to build up to the Constitution and then go into the comparison of the U.S. Confederate Constitution. So I'll turn the floor over to y'all before I ask my one question on the Federalist Papers.
Well, the Federalist, I actually kind of
Robot.
Yeah.
Some technical issues.
what the impetus for the Constitution was. You really need to go to the notes of the Philadelphia Convention and more. And as are you there?
We're here. You cut out, but we heard. Last thing you said was Philadelphia Convention.
Saying about the Federalist Essays. Federalist Papers is a relatively new term, but the Federalist Essays were a series of newspaper articles. They actually had no sway over the Constitution outside the state of New York. They weren't circulated to most of the other states until after ratification had been achieved. However, and by the way, in his book, New Views of the Constitution, the Federalist Essay.
You went sideways.
Are we back yet?
There we go.
Yeah,
I cut out. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll pick up where I think I left off. The Federalist Essays were not persuasive at all outside the state of New York. As they were being written, they weren't actually even circulated to most of the ratifying states until after ratification had been achieved. John Taylor of Caroline, in his book New Views of the Constitution, shredded the Federalist Essays as being contradictory and kind of basically a lot of double talk in some areas. The more important part of what you said in terms of understanding the Constitution is going back to the actual debates, either in Philadelphia and especially in the various state ratifying conventions. I think the Federalist Essays are important in understanding that the proponents or the authors of them were arguing, trying to achieve ratification, I should say, by arguing a states' rights position. But to get a complete picture of what was actually going on and to put things of that era into context, yeah, you need to read all of it. Just don't put too much sway into the Federalists, because the actual debates themselves were far more important.
Yep. Yeah, I agree 100%, Carl. And also, too, remember what Madison said when they were talking about issues of interpreting the Constitution, understanding what the Constitution meant. Madison said you needed to simply look at the Constitution itself. It's written in relatively plain language. But he said if you need an interpretation, look at the ratification debates, because Madison went on to say that's where the Constitution received all of its power and authority, was from the ratification, or from the states, the opinions of the ratification convention. So that's very important to remember the ratification convention debates. There's a lot of stuff about the Constitution in there, but Carl's exactly right, particularly when it comes to Hamilton. I mean, if you look at what Hamilton was trying to do at the convention, I mean, he was in favor of a lifetime presidency, almost a monarchy for the country and all of that kind of stuff. But if you read his Federalist Papers, he sounds like a states' rights guy. And because New York, with about 2/3 of the delegates in New York when they first met, was against the Constitution. And they wrote those essays, as Carl said, in the New York newspapers to persuade people. And they eventually persuaded enough people reading that kind of stuff. But Madison was lying through his teeth.
And it still only passed ratification in New York by a margin of 3 votes.
Right. It didn't swing it very far. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. And it's weird that you mentioned that about Hamilton. Before we got on the stream, I was actually talking to Carl about Federalist Number 9, where he writes, this form of government is a convention by which several smaller states agree to become members of a larger one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But my view on his term using the word agree there, of course, I'm a complete novice on this. When he says agree, that sounds like it's a voluntary thing, which goes to the whole issue of states' rights, voluntarily joining the union and then voluntarily leaving. So it brings the question, some almost 80 years later, why couldn't the southern states voluntarily haul out when they wanted to, especially if Hamilton's writing that way, and if the word agree means the same thing that it did today as it does in the late 1700s. So the next question that I had was about the Constitution. So what were the primary aims of the framers of the Constitution in creating this document? I know in the preamble, it's they say to make a more perfect union, provide for common defense, liberty, promote general welfare, yada yada yada. But Carl had actually mentioned that he mentioned something earlier. I'm just going to turn it over there and see if he wants to, or either one of y'all want to chime in with it on that question.
So you're asking what was the primary purpose of the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, or at least the Constitutional Convention. I mean, we had the Articles of Confederation, to start off with, but I believe you said that when it was originally called, it was called to amend the article.
That was I contend, and well, anybody that pays attention is contending that it was called under subterfuge. It was trickery to some degree. They had the Annapolis Convention before that, and basically nobody showed up essentially. So they planned the Philadelphia Convention a year later or so, and under the pretense of amending the existing Constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation. And of course, that was when Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry from Virginia were both voted as delegates to attend in Philadelphia, and both refused to go. Richard Henry Lee stated, "I don't believe those people would recommend any amendments that I would approve of." And in his typical form, Patrick Henry was more succinct. He said, "I smell a rat." They knew something was up, so they got there to Philadelphia, and I believe the first vote they took was to close the doors, to do everything in a closed door session. The second was to elect George Washington to preside over the Constitution. And because they knew nobody, these are the Federalists, these are the big government guys. And as Luther Martin said, the Federalists, those calling themselves the Federalists, were not actual Federalists. They were a mixture of nationalists and monarchists. And so they knew that nobody would call Washington's integrity into question. So that was why they elected him. And so they're in a closed door meeting, and all of a sudden, Edmund Randolph of Virginia rolls out this plan called the Virginia Plan, which, as Ryan said, called for a perpetual presidency. It also called for high tariffs. It also called for and what Hamilton wanted was the appointment of your state governor by the federal government. Okay, so in other words, you would not get to elect your own state representative. Well, this plan was shredded in convention. What we're told today, what came out of it, all right, so that was the original pretense. What came out of the Constitution, we are told today, was what the purpose of the actual Constitution, in other words, that the states have ultimately ratified, was very simple. We're going to put together a loose federal union, and Madison called it to his dying day a federal constitution, and the purposes were to facilitate trade between the states and with foreign nations, and to provide a common defense, and nothing else very much beyond that.
Right. They actually violated the instructions that the Articles Congress gave them, which was to simply amend the Articles. There are some political theorists who have even gone so far as to say, is the Constitution even legal, since the convention violated what Congress had said they could do? But yeah, that commerce had a lot to do with it and other things, but that was at least the guise, because there was not much of an economy. States had tariffs between one another. And that was the idea. That's what, going back to the Annapolis Convention, that was the purpose of that. And then in Philadelphia, they said, well, we'll open it up and we'll look at everything. And that's what they did. And if Hamilton would have had his way, it would have been far different today. And if you realize, Hamilton tried to get some of those ideas in early, and he was, as Carl said, they pretty much shredded a lot of that kind of stuff. Hamilton actually left for a long time. He was not there at the middle part of the convention. He came back toward the end. But then, of course, as we saw later, they'll use the courts and other things to try to get what they wanted under the Federalist Party.
Yeah. Which, and I didn't even know that about the non-election of governors. How could we even have a republic if that would have passed? Would it sound like more like a constitutional monarchy, like what is in Great Britain now?
Well, Hamilton liked Britain.
Yeah, he did. That's right. That was the big accusation, that Hamilton was a monarchist. And as I said earlier, Luther Martin of Maryland claimed there were three parties at the Constitution. There were nationalists, monarchists, and true federalists. The true federalists were the ones they called the anti-federalists. They were the ones that wanted the separation of powers between the state and the general government.
Liberals and progressives have been playing with language for more than 200 years. I mean, they do it now.
Politicians have been back since the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So eventually, what comes out of the Philadelphia Convention eventually does get ratified. And we continue on for a couple of decades, and eventually the ideas of interpretation of the Constitution, of course, they come to they come to a head, so to speak, in 1860. Well, the election 1860. And of course, the South secedes from the Union. 7 states, they form a. Let me pull out their words exactly. Each state acting in its sovereign and independent character joined together to form a permanent federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and prosperity, excuse me, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, so on and so forth, and they formed the Confederate government. And this is, McClanahan, who does the podcast for the Institute. He did one on his own podcast on constitutional history in the United States. He did talk about the Confederate Constitution in it. But here's one question that I have for y'all. That it's a softball question. I hope it is.
Hey, Connor.
Hey.
Can we back up because you glossed over something very important? Hold that thought.
Oh, well, yeah. I will hold.
I want to touch on something very important, and I think Ryan will agree with me on this. The preamble to the Confederate Constitution is extremely important, and I understand, like I tried to tell our so-called the debate opponents last week. The preamble does not have any legal authority. It's not a delegation of powers. It's simply a statement of purpose. However, there's something very telling in the Confederate Constitution's preamble compared to that of the U.S. Constitution. It says, "We, the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character." That's very important because to this day, 200 some odd years later, we still misconstrue what the United States Constitution preamble says. We think it says "we the people." It does not. It says "we the people of the United States." The intent, if you go back and read those debates of that phrase, was each state individually. In other words, in fact, the original Constitution, before it was changed in the Committee of Style in 1787, it said "we the people of Virginia, Massachusetts, South Carolina, North Carolina," and so forth and so on. It named each state independently or individually. And so what transpired, especially in the Lincolnian era, was this idea that this one mass of people, independent of their states, it was this great American people, got together and ratified the Constitution. That argument was going on even before Lincoln took office. Was it a ratification of the people or the people of the independent states? And so the states clarified that, the Confederate states clarified that in their own preamble by saying each state acting in its sovereign and independent character. It was to show that the Constitution was not a compact among people, but a compact among states. And go back to James Madison, he defined a state as the people of the state acting in their highest sovereign capacity. So there was no difference in the preamble except in the wording. Again, the United States Constitution was ambiguous and easily misconstrued, and the Confederate Constitution sought to correct that misunderstanding.
Yeah, and how much ambiguity is in the original federal Constitution?
Well,
right, because we argue all the time about it. Look at all the arguments it created throughout all the years. Ambiguity. I mean, "we the people" is, the great story from Patrick Henry. He got stuck on the first 3 words, "we the people." He said, "I'm done with
That's right.
I've had it with this." But there's enough. I mean, you look at the different arguments, whether it's the Webster, Joseph Story, Lincoln argument of a national union or not. So there was enough ambiguity they could argue about it. There's not in the Confederate Constitution.
Yeah, and that's one thing. What?
It's like Ryan said earlier. Progressives, and look, there were progressives well before we called them progressives. Okay, Lincoln was a progressive. Hamilton was a progressive. And progressives have been misconstruing our language for a long, long time and still continue to do so.
Yeah. So, and talking about, and it seems like just from my reading, because I read reread the Confederate Constitution right before the stream started. The one thing that really, besides that, and the fact that, the Confederate Constitution does invoke the favor and guidance of Almighty God, whereas the federal Constitution doesn't. Looking through it, in the Confederate Constitution, there is no Bill of Rights. But if you study into the other sections of it, the Bill of Rights is already built into the Confederate Constitution. Which why did the Confederate framers do it that way as compared to the federal framers? Why did the federal framers have to go back and send those amendments to the states?
I've got my opinions, but I'll defer to Ryan on that.
Well, that was one of the big flaws when they created the Constitution. A lot of people that they called the anti-federalists said there's no Bill of Rights. That was one of the things Jefferson didn't like. It was no Bill of Rights. And there's been a lot of talk about that. Was that deliberately? Probably. And of course, some people have said, would we have more liberty today if we did not have a Bill of Rights? I know people have theorized that because the courts today have taken that and bent it up and twisted it up. And I don't know. I feel a little safer with a Bill of Rights, but yeah, the Confederates put it directly into the document. They didn't have to go back and amend it because they left it off. A lot of states probably would not have ratified it had it not been in there, had they not promised, okay, in the first Congress, we're going to go in and pass the Bill of Rights, and they did.
Well, what's your opinion on it there, Carl?
I pretty much what Ryan said. I think that they intentionally. I think that the nationalists, to some degree, and certainly the monarchists that Luther Martin referred to, were trying to slip through something of an ambiguous document. And the reason the Confederate, as Ryan said, the reason the Confederate Constitution didn't need a Bill of Rights was because they had clarified the language that this is a compact among states. And then the most important of those Bill of Rights were actually included within the body of the Constitution itself. And you got to understand something regarding the Bill of Rights. People think that First Amendment is our most important. Free speech is our most important because it was labeled first, and Second Amendment was our second most important because it was enumerated second. No, that's exactly backwards. Hands down, if you go by the request by the states during the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, if you go by the number of requests, the 10th Amendment was the most important. It was by far the most requested. The 9th Amendment was the second most requested, and it was, second most important, according to the states. But James Madison inverted these. Now, why would he do that? Well, very simple. He didn't want a Bill of Rights. So it was inverted in number of importance. Well, look at the what we would call the Bill of Rights in the context or in the body of the Confederate Constitution. They didn't have to come in and put these amendments in there. They clarified the rights of the states and the separation of powers throughout the entire document, and then added those two amendments into the body by themselves right out of the starting gate.
And they put in mechanisms to enforce them. One problem with the 10th Amendment, that Calhoun tried to work on and others, was how do you enforce that? What if the federal government does overstep its bounds? I mean, there are things in the Confederate Constitution that give them, the states, ways to handle that. And I think that's what they were trying to do, was strengthen those amendments in that manner.
Yeah, which talking about that, really does pinpoint me to my next question. Are the powers, adequately limited in either document? The powers between federal and state. I know, and I softball, because I believe the Confederates Constitution was adequately limited. but also intergovernmental checks and balances. Were those adequately in either of the constitutions, in y'all's opinion?
In the U.S. Constitution, no. And how do I know that? Well, look at what you have today. You know, I think it is. I think it's been proven without, irrefutably, without question, that the United States Constitution, we know it cannot or it could not restrain the federal government because it has not restrained the federal government. The federal government does whatever it wants to do.
Yeah. Right, and there's not any mechanisms really to deal with it, and I think that's one of the weaknesses. But with the Confederate Constitution, you've got a lot of things in there where they not only do they have mechanisms, there's more restraint placed on the Confederate government, particularly in terms of economics, spending money, tariffs, and that kind of thing. They made it much harder for the federal government, or the Confederate government, I should say, to build what our current federal government has built. I mean, it would have been almost impossible to do it, or much more difficult. I think Carl wrote in a Facebook post, I think earlier this week, Carl, about the fact that the progressive movement would have never taken hold in the Confederacy. And I think that's true for a lot of reasons, and particularly with the Constitution, there was just almost no way for it to happen.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Ryan, I think also that you have to tie, I think you'll agree with me on this. I think you have to juxtapose the language, the very specific language of the Confederate Constitution with the culture of the South. I think as much as anything, it's reflective of our culture. We are mistrusting of government. And I think when you take what Clyde Wilson calls I love the way Clyde put it. So there is no deep South. That's a myth. There's a deep North. Everything else is just America. And when you take the deep North out of the equation and their libido dominandi, the lust for dominance, when you take that out of the equation, and you have the Confederate Constitution with the traditional culture of the Southern people, I think that would make it even harder for a growth and centralization of powers. Let me put this in. This is Lord Acton. He was. I know y'all have all read this, but there may be others watching that haven't heard it. And Lord Acton was an English libertarian. He was an English philosopher, John Dahlberg Acton, and this was from his 1866 correspondence with Robert E. Lee after the war had ended. I want you to hear what an Englishman, an English philosopher said. And this is, somewhat of a long paragraph. I'll try not to be boring reading, but here we go. He says, without presuming to decide the purely legal question on which it seems evident to me from Madison's and Hamilton's papers that the fathers of the Constitution were not agreed, here's where he gets very poignant. I saw in states' rights the only availing check upon the absolutism of the sovereign will, and secession filled me with hope, not as a destruction, but as the redemption of democracy. The institutions of your republic, and he's talking to Robert E. Lee, your republic have not exercised on the old world the salutary and liberating influences which ought to have belonged to them by reason of those defects and abuses of principle which the Confederate Constitution was expressly and wisely calculated to remedy. I believe that the example of that great reform would have blessed all the races of mankind by establishing true freedom, purged of the native dangers and disorders of republics. Therefore, I deemed that you were fighting the battles of our liberty, our progress, and our civilization, and I mourn for the stake which was lost at Richmond more deeply than I rejoice over that which was saved at Waterloo. This is an Englishman saying that. He had read into the purpose of the Confederate Constitution. When he talks about the absolutism of the sovereign will, what he's talking about is monarchy. In other words, when you have a monarch, what my will is absolute. And here's an English libertarian for his day, philosopher, saying that the Confederate Constitution was wisely calculated to remedy the growth of such a government.
Well, yeah, well, so I'll just go ahead and jump on, you know, kind of backtrack for a second, something that Ron had talked about, and you, of course, in that quote, talking about the limitation of government. In Article 1, Section 8, subsection 1 of the Confederate Constitution, it talks about how pretty much the government cannot use any duties or taxes on any importation to be used for internal improvements. Why did the Confederate framers feel that that was so necessary to include in their Constitution?
That argument had gone on throughout the antebellum period. That was something that nationalists in the federal government had been trying to do. And of course, fortunately, we had a string of Southern presidents that did not allow those types of projects to go on. Internal improvements projects. What we don't use that term today. Today, we call them pork barrel spending. And the budget's filled with that kind of stuff, right? Crazy stuff, not just roads and bridges and things like that, but all kind of silly, crazy stuff that, you know, they spend millions of dollars watching a shrimp run on a treadmill, or, you know, they spent millions of dollars one time studying the gambling habits of monkeys. And, you know, the budget is just chock full of that stuff. And it's crony capitalism is what it is. And not just that provision of the Confederate Constitution, but others were calculated to keep that kind of stuff from happening. It was harder to spend money. If you look at the Confederate Constitution, it takes a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress under normal budgetary procedures to spend money. The president had a line item veto. He could take all that kind of stuff out of specific spending bills. So there's a lot of things like that designed. So it would have been hard for crony capitalism to ever have taken hold in the Confederacy.
Oh, that'd have been nice. I remember, you know, a couple years ago, speaking against, I think a pork barrel full defense spending bill. I think it was that. I can't remember, but it was either Rand or Ron Paul getting up and talking about how we just spent, you know, millions of dollars to build natural gas gas stations in Iraq. And you know, that's just I never realized it until then. That's what, you know, really made my political awakening happening. Was hearing that when, you know, heck, I don't know anybody in the United States that drives a car that is fueled on natural gas, and we're building one in a second world country. I mean, come on.
Second world.
Yeah.
I was being nice.
Don't be.
But yeah, which I have a feeling that, well, and before I get on to get onto that, Ron, I think you're reading my sheet of all my questions because you're just, you know, lining me up for the next one. But and maybe that's my misinterpretation, but I always thought internal improvements were things like you know, the dams and locks and stuff over the Erie Canal. Is that just a wrong interpretation of mine, or is that something that has something to do with it?
That's what it was originally. But of course, there were efforts, even in the antebellum period. You can go back. There were actually efforts at welfare to give, you know, pensions and all these kind of things, and help to widows and things like that. I mean, but originally, yes, but you've seen how it's grown all the way through the progressive era. Now this internal improvements, and of course the federal government's now in charge of creating jobs and doing that kind of thing. And so when you look at the budgets and you see all this crazy stuff like natural gas stations in Iraq, of course they'll probably argue that's part of national defense. But when you see all these things that they spend on, they'll tell you it creates jobs. That's not what they're supposed to do. It doesn't create jobs. It actually hurts the economy when they do those kind of things. But yeah, you can see how it's to use their word, how it's progressed. It's gone from from we need to build a road or a dam to now we got to fund schools and we have to do all this kind of stuff and Checkers Hall of Fame and and all this Cowboy Hall of Fame and all these things that you get money for. They spend money on aquariums and all kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah, and I would think the only place, and this is just again my opinion, the only place where really that should belong is within the 10th Amendment. It should be up to the states if they want to waste their own money
Yeah.
to study gambling habits of Matt. Then that should be Tennessee's responsibility.
I see what you did there.
Yeah,
But,
I think he just called you a monkey.
Yes,
I've been called
very,
worse.
very astute there, Carl. But something like that, Tennessee should have to pay for that. Mississippi shouldn't have to pay for that. If Mississippi wants to build, toll roads is my prime example of what it should be. The way a state should operate with its money. Georgia has toll roads, Florida has toll roads, Mississippi doesn't. We need them, but that's our choice. But
I'm out here in Texas, so
yeah.
Florida's got toll roads and they're in excellent condition too. Let me tell you. You ever drove down the turnpike?
Yes, they do. They have good stuff too.
Yeah, the other thing that I found interesting in the Confederate Constitution, we'll get a little bit back on topic of questions, is that for the post office, and I didn't check it in the U.S. Constitution, but the Confederate Constitution requires it to be completely self-sufficient.
and it was.
That's the same. Yeah,
That's not in the U.S. Constitution. The post office is, but there's no requirement to it to operate out of its own revenues. And people have studied the Confederate post office, and I never have, but John H. Reagan from Texas that ran it, it was completely self-sufficient. They say it's one of the best run post offices in American history, because we know how well our post office is run now, right? It only loses billions of dollars a year that they want to handle ballots, but the Confederate post office was self-sufficient. It did not use general revenues. So it did work well.
Yeah.
Well, anytime the federal government gets involved with running something, it's going to get screwed up. That's just how it is.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the Confederate president's line item veto, but and you mentioned crony capitalism. The Confederate Constitution limited the Confederate president to only having 1 6-year term.
Right.
Do you think that a 1 6-year term nationally would also, of course, term limits as well on Congress? God, we need an amendment for that. But do you think that would help prevent? What would have helped prevent other, like you said, crony capitalist ideas, or not ideas, but crony capitalism from developing within the United States?
I personally like the 1 6-year term. I think they had it exactly right. I think the idea was you wouldn't go through this divisive, nasty re-election campaign that we're witnessing right now. Now, some people say, well, that would give him 6 years to just do whatever he wanted to do. Well, not really. You got a constitution with a lot of, restraint in it. Personally, I think that's the way to go. I wish we did it that way, but I may be out. That may be my only. I may be the only one that agrees with that.
What do you think, Carl?
Let me back up from there, because Ryan mentioned earlier, this is a wake up call I like to give to everybody that loves Hamilton. Ryan mentioned earlier about Hamilton and his support for a perpetual presidency. In other words, in the Virginia plan, the so-called Virginia plan that was brought forward, you would have had when somebody was elected president, they would be president until death. If Hamilton had gotten his way, Jimmy Carter would be your president today.
Oh,
Great
dear
point.
God.
Great point.
Okay. So if I can't sway you against Hamilton by any other means, that ought to wake you up. All right. But to the question, no, I agree with Ryan. You got to look at what any of them have had to do. they get into office on their first term, and their first 2 years or first year, 2 years, they try to accomplish what they can accomplish. They spend a majority of their next 2 years running for reelection. And it's, best case scenario, they hit a bit, they hit a bit of a stone wall there.
Yeah.
And you've got these, I mean, I don't know of another time in American history when this point in a person's presidency that it's always been nasty. I don't recall it ever being as nasty as it is right now. And I talk about politics and the political parties pretty objectively. I'm very objective. I hate everybody. Okay. So
I agree with Carl 100%. I hate them all.
No, I don't hate them. I don't have anything against most of them as individuals. I don't like the agenda of most of them. But if you limited that to a 1 6-year term, I do think Ryan. I think he makes some valid points there. It's would it be the be all to end all? I don't know. I think that the more important aspects of what the Confederate Constitution brought, that was, regardless of how long he's in office, the document itself limited what he could do, and that's the big problem. Whether he's in there, you can get the guy in there that he's in there for a year and wreak all sorts of havoc 12 more years, but it's the limitations in the separation of powers doctrine that's really the bigger issue to me. That's my take on it. I don't know if I answered the question or not, but
Go ahead.
now look at my favorite provision of the Constitution, the Confederate Constitution. My favorite provision that I think is the most important part of it. It's something that I wish our Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, had in it. And it's in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, where it gives the state legislatures the authority to impeach and remove any federal official operating within the bounds of their state. If you read that provision, our Constitution says the House of Representatives has the sole power of impeachment, right? We all know that. We think about impeaching the president. But in the Confederate Constitution, it says it, but then it says, except that any judicial or other federal officer resident and acting solely within the limits of any state may be impeached by a vote of 2/3 of both branches of the legislature thereof, that being the key point. So if you have a federal judge, think about our government, a federal judge, IRS, ATF, whatever, that's operating in Mississippi or Florida or Alabama, and they overstep their bounds, the state could get rid of them. And I think that's important to remember. It would have been very, very hard to have ever built this massive government that we have, not to mention the other aspects of it. That they, like you said, they can't fund internal improvements. They can't pay bounties. It specifically says no bounty shall be granted from the Treasury. 2/3 vote to spend money, no protective tariffs, line item veto. There's also a provision that prevents cost overruns, which I think is important, right? How much we appropriate money for a building, and when we end up spending 4 or 5 times as much for the building. The Confederate Constitution specifically says they cannot grant any more money to a project than what the contract says. So they were looking at 70 plus years of constitutional history and saying, this is the problems that we need to correct. And I think they did a fantastic job realizing that and correcting it and doing that, limiting the power of the federal government.
Yeah. And we actually had somebody in the chat leave us a question. Of course, anybody else in the chat, if you have questions for the panel, please do put it out. I'm going to ask the producer to read that question, and both you and Carl, please chime in on it.
Question is from Richmond 12. He asked, how did the Confederate Constitution address navigation and commerce that the United States Constitution did not?
Well, commerce was a big part of it. That was particularly if you read Jefferson Davis's first inaugural address. I mean, he's laying it out that we're going to have commerce with the entire world, free and open trade with the entire world. And if you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Confederate Constitution, when it lays out the powers of Congress, if you look at Clause 3, that's regulating commerce, and that's where we get no internal improvements. It says to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Well, we have that, and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. But neither this nor any other clause contained in the Constitution shall ever be construed to delegate the power to Congress to appropriate money for an internal improvement intended to facilitate commerce, except, and it goes on to give some exceptions to that, except for the purpose of furnishing lights, beacons, and buoys and navigation upon the coasts, and the improvement of harbors and the removing of obstructions in river navigation. So things that were national in scope that would facilitate commerce, yeah, the government could spend money on that, but not, and it was just on that particular thing, not building road across or a railroad across the country and spending tons of money and giving railroad companies millions of dollars and millions of acres of land like the Lincoln government did to build the transcontinental railroad. You don't have that kind of power and authorities but you actually have prohibitions against it. You can't pay bounties to railroad companies. You can't do that kind of stuff. So the commerce that they're facilitating is trade with the whole world, which is what Jefferson Davis said we wanted. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. I think, speaking of questions, the last question I have, I kind of want to save. I was going to turn it over to Matt and Harrison, see if they wanted to ask anything before I throw out my last question of the evening.
You got anything?
You want to know if I want to ask any questions?
Yeah. You or Harrison or anybody in the chat, because I want to save my favorite question for last.
Oh man, they've answered everything I want to know. I came on tonight. I mean, I'm not really astute in this kind of stuff, but I've learned a lot sitting here tonight and listening to you guys. It seems to me like the Constitution is more written as it seems to lean more towards the socialism now than it did back then, I guess. I mean, the way that people interpret it, it looks like they'd much rather have socialism now in our country than any kind of freedom. But I don't really have a question. I mean, I don't. So if Harrison's got me,
let me tag the end of that, Matt. I don't think that the founders, the framers or ratifiers of the U.S. Constitution necessarily wanted socialism. But I do think there were, as we mentioned earlier, there were ambiguities in the document. Patrick Henry referred to certain clauses, notably the General Welfare Clause, which, by the way, those two words were in the preamble and Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, and they were omitted entirely.
Oh, we lost Carl for a second.
And boy, howdy, he's on a roll too.
He was on a good one.
We lost you after general welfare.
Okay, so the General Welfare Clause in both the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, and it was also in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, and it was omitted entirely from the Confederate Constitution. Well, Patrick Henry in the Virginia Convention, this is Virginia Ratifying Convention, referred to the general welfare and the necessary and proper clauses as being the sweeping clauses, meaning they could be interpreted any number of ways. They were not concise. They were not clear enough. As Ryan and I talked about earlier in the discussion, Hamilton argued a states' rights position during the ratification process. After the Constitution achieved ratification, he started unsaying everything he had said. This is when he came in and, devised the concept of implied powers, which Lincoln built off of. Lincoln had the implied powers to do as he did. And of course, Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton told the country that you have to read between the lines of the Constitution to find the implied powers. And Jefferson said, he remarked, I have read between the lines of the Constitution, and all I found was blank space. So even that early on, you had this argument going forth, back and forth. And I wouldn't say that the intent of the U.S. Constitution was to inflict socialism, but I would say because of what Patrick Henry referred to as these sweeping clauses, and I would throw at this point, and I think Ron will agree with me on this, in addition to general welfare necessary and proper, you have to also throw commerce and supremacy in there among those ambiguous clauses. And I think it is those ambiguities that led to where we are today, in addition to a violent overthrow of the Constitution by Lincoln, who paved the way for the still ongoing progressive era. But I think if you hadn't had those ambiguities, I don't think that we would be where we are today.
Yeah, agreed, 100%. Yeah.
Well, and of course the judicial, and their interpretation of certain things, what I'm assuming has.
Well, and Connor, let me say something on that, because I did not know this until actually Ryan and myself and Brian McClanahan and I can't remember who else was there at the conference we put on in Alabama, and Ryan was gracious enough to come up that year and be one of our speakers. But I had never heard this before. If you look at the Confederate Constitution, Article 3, like the U.S. Constitution, allowed for the creation of a Supreme Court. However, the Confederate government never enacted one. I think that's extremely interesting.
Agreed. I mean, we were talking about the anti-federalist papers. I always tell people when they're complaining about the state of the judiciary today, and I think the great Clyde Wilson is right. Originally, sovereignty was supposed to be in the end with the people of the states. Sovereignty clearly today is with the Supreme Court. If you look at the anti-federalist papers, that's exactly what they attacked about as hard as anything else. If you read Brutus's discussion of the judiciary, and a lot of people, we don't know exactly who Brutus was, but whoever he was smart. But what he said was, the way the judiciary is set up in the U.S. Constitution, it would to be able to mold the government into whatever form they wanted it. And I think the Confederates were smart enough to say, well, who knows if they ever would have had a Supreme Court. We don't know if they would have had one. I hope we wouldn't have one today if we were in the Confederacy, but you can see how dangerous the judiciary was. And anti-federalists saw that before the ink was ever dry on the paper, what was going to happen. They were 100% right.
Yeah. Producer, you had a question?
No. I think we've answered all my questions for the day.
All right.
Above and beyond.
I will ask my one question that I've been holding on to. How is West Virginia legal?
It's not.
It's not.
Thank you. For those that don't understand, I'm talking about Article 4, Section 3. The new states may be admitted to Congress into this union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states or parts of states without the consent of the legislature of the states concerned, as well as of the Congress. And I think that's pretty much verbatim what's in the Confederate Constitution too.
Well, the Confederate Constitution is interesting. If you look at the Confederate Constitution's clause, it does something in addition there. It says other states, what it says in the U.S. Constitution, that states may be admitted to this union or, admitted. The Confederate Constitution says other states may be admitted into this Confederacy by a vote of 2/3 of the whole House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate, and the Senate voting by states. That's what it says. It doesn't say that in the U.S. Constitution. That's why when you get different ways that states came in. Texas came into the Union by a joint resolution of Congress, not a treaty. So so what they sought to do was to say it's got to be a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate. That would have been making it a whole lot harder to do that. But you're exactly right. That other part about you can't divide states up, and the reason that's in the Constitution is because the state is sovereign. You can't divide sovereign territory without that state's permission. But Lincoln did it, and if you read his justification for it, it is quite interesting. His exact words were, when he was approached, people said, "Wait a minute, you're opposed to secession, but you're doing this with West Virginia." His exact words were, "Well, there's secession in favor of the Constitution and secession against the Constitution, and this is favor of secession in favor of the Constitution." That's perfect lawyer language.
Wow.
I must say that is a lawyer's dodge if I ever heard it.
Yeah. Well, and it should also be noted that in the midst of his supposed grand crusade to end slavery, West Virginia was admitted as a slave state.
It was.
And since I've opened up the Pandora's box, are we going to talk about slavery or not?
Well, yeah. Well, that's.
I was wondering if we were going to get on that topic. Yeah, that's something we definitely.
And
Well,
we do have two questions in the chat before we get on that.
Do what?
I said we do
I'm
have
sorry.
two questions in the chat before we get on that good topic.
Oh, we got two what?
Two
Two questions in the chat.
Send it.
So the first one is the Confederate Congress debated a Supreme Court. It might have helped the can't really read that from here.
Then lean in.
I'm trying. Does anybody else got the chat up?
I don't.
My phone's about to die, so I can turn it off.
All right. Well, let me see while I'm working on that.
I'll tell you
If I
what, we're
can
gonna
send it.
fire you. That's what's gonna happen.
I'm surprised you haven't already, if we're being honest.
I have habeas.
All right. So we're going to not skip that question, but come back. Second question is,
Go ahead.
all right. The second question is, how long before a Supreme Court was created? How long was it before a Supreme Court was created after the Constitution was created?
In the United States?
Let's just go
US.
ahead.
Created right off the bat.
Yeah, it was immediate.
John Jay was the first Chief Justice. Washington loaded it up immediately. And there were important cases throughout the 1790s. Of course, Marshall was not put on it until 1800, and then it all went downhill. But it was immediate.
The other question in the chat was the Confederate Congress debated a Supreme Court. It might have helped, or at least it's a comment, it might have helped the habeas corpus cases raised by people like North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Richmond Pearson. That's something I'm completely ignorant about. So
I have to plead ignorant myself on that one.
I didn't understand.
Carl, you got anything?
Was there a question there? I didn't understand that there was a question.
yeah, I believe it was more of a comment. Just saying that I guess the guy's trying to say that the Confederacy did something, or the federal government maybe did something to habeas corpus violating, which of course we know the Federals did violate habeas corpus. Look at the Maryland Secession Convention, and other times. Yeah. So let's dive into the as Jefferson I believe called it, the peculiar institution. Everybody says that the big difference between the U.S. Constitution, which we've clearly debunked that tonight, the thing that the Confederate Constitution was a copy of the U.S. Constitution, except that it dealt with slavery had more information on slavery than the federal Constitution did, and it gave the president a lot on veto in a 6-year term. What specific differences dealing with the institution of slavery did the Confederate Constitution have that the federal Constitution didn't have?
The easy answer to that is in the definition. All right, the Confederate Constitution called it slavery, and the U.S. Constitution called it persons held to labor or service. But other than that, it was always under either constitution within the power of the states to determine the outcome of slavery. There was another somewhat of a distinction, and that was that the U.S. Constitution ended slavery, or ended the slave trade, the importation of slaves, at 20 years beyond the date of ratification, which turned out to be 1708. Whereas the Confederate Constitution ended it immediately. It forbade it, from the outset. Other than that, both constitutions left the institution entirely in the hands of the individual states. And that was what the Confederate Constitution did. I mean, it was no different. All it did was specified this. And the reason it did so was because the U.S. Constitution, or I should say, Northern industrial mercantilist type politicians, Republicans, radical Republicans, were trying to use the institution in defiance of the U.S. Constitution. They were trying to use slavery as a means of controlling or inflicting power over the Confederates, the Southern states, the slave states. Slavery in the vernacular of the Northern industrialists was a euphemism for the word power. That's what it was. They were trying to stop the spread of slavery into the Western territories as a means of forcing them to come into the Union as free states in order to choke off Southern representation. That's what the slavery was all about. Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution, stated that, slaves who escaped into a free state had to be delivered up and that sort of thing. Well, the Confederate Constitution just simply went in and explicitly stated, as everybody had understood it up to that time, the United States Constitution implied. Again, here we go with the ambiguities. You got to go back and read the debates to understand the U.S. Constitution. To understand the Confederate Constitution, you just read the text. Okay, but they simply came in and explicitly said that this is a state issue. Now, an interesting thing, I guess it was about 8 or 10 years ago, I watched pseudo historian David Barton on the Glenn Beck show, and both these guys are, forgive me if y'all like them, I'm sorry, I'm just going to tell it like it is. They're a couple of frauds. Both of them are a couple of frauds. And I saw the two of them on a show, and Beck claimed to have read the original Confederate Constitution, and he tells Barton, well, it's all about slavery. It was obvious from the text. Well, no, not if you understand the variances between the U.S. and Confederate, or the similarities between the two. And then Barton came on and said, he's supposed to be this big self-professed historical genius. And he says, well, as a matter of fact, the Confederate Constitution mandated that to be a part of the Confederacy, you had to be a slave state. Well, first of all, it says that absolutely nowhere in the Confederate Constitution. And second of all, Thomas R. Cobb of Georgia, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, I believe he's from Georgia, brought that up in committee when they had divided up into committees in the Montgomery Convention when the Confederate Constitution was being formed. He brought up the idea, he said, we should allow only slave states to enter into the Confederation, or the Confederacy. And Robert Barnwell Rhett, who was a noted fire eater of the day, shot it down. He stood up and argued against him, and Cobb's proposal was rejected unanimously. Well, why was that so? Because you had other states, and I believe the other states they were referring to were probably specifically Ohio, Indiana, probably Illinois, probably Pennsylvania. These were states that had very agrarian cultures in them that they believed would ultimately break off from the Yankee states, the deep North, and want to join the Confederacy, even though they had abandoned slavery. And why would we not welcome them? So this whole idea that the Confederate Constitution was all about slavery, that's one of the biggest boneheaded, incompetent myths ever promulgated about that document and about the formation of the Confederate government.
Do you
Well
think
said.
slavery would have died out in the South if it had just been left alone?
It had no choice.
Yeah.
There's no other way around it. Think about it. This is common sense, okay? And I'm not aiming that at you. I know that's a rhetorical question, okay? But
Yeah.
You're a slave owner. And by the way, let me throw this in there too. The largest slave owners in the South, when secession was being debated, were opposed to secession. Why? Because they knew that it was better protected by remaining in the Union under the U.S. Constitution than it would be if they separated. They were not members of the Democrat Party. They were members of the Constitutional Union Party, a party that was made up of your large, wealthy plantation owners. Those were the guys who were opposed to secession. All right, why would it have died out? Well, put yourself in the place of a large plantation owner. You've got 200 slaves that you've got to feed, house, clothe, and provide medical care for year round. They're only working really about 5 or 6 months out of the year during, crop season, but you got to house them throughout the year. Now the industrial age is coming into play. We're starting to get tractors and combines and backhoes and all these other farming implements. Which is easier to keep up, 200 slaves or one combine? So simple economics would have dictated the end of slavery, by default, number one. Number two, we need to also point out here that out of 29 countries in the Western Hemisphere, we were the only one who ended it through warfare and the death and bloodshed of 1 million of our population. The only one. You had third world countries that ended it through compensated emancipation or other economic means.
Yeah,
Brazil.
Russia in 60, I was gonna say Russia in 62 or 63, I can't remember. They freed the serfs.
Yeah. Brazil was a much more entrenched slave society than the South. When you look at the slave census with the African slave trade, how many slaves were actually brought to? Now, if you ask some students and some of these woke people, where'd all the slaves go when they came from Africa? You know what they're going to say, right? They all came to the South, every one of them.
Yeah.
But out of maybe 10 million slaves that were, or Africans that were transported to the New World, only about 400,000 came to what is the United States. Brazil had more than anybody, more than 3.5 million. Brazil was a very, very brutal slave society, and it ended by the early 1880s. It was gone in Brazil. As Carl said, economics changes everything.
Oh, that's an argument I've had with many woke folks that it would have just eventually
So have
died
I.
out. And they constantly tell you that we had to fight a war.
At least for
Had
you,
to
they
be
just
done.
tell you.
Had to be done. Had to be done.
Well, and look, I would submit here, that over time, language changes. Ryan, alluded to that earlier on, that the vernacular changes, and I think in today's world, woke means brain dead.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
I'll
Well,
agree with that as well.
Stuck in a
Well, anything
fantasy
else?
world.
Yeah. Anything else you gentlemen want to bring up while we're still on?
I think that's a perfect one to end it on.
It's been a good show, man. I've learned a lot tonight. I've learned a lot more than I usually do when we sit around and talk about stuff. So
Yeah, well, I do want to again thank y'all, both Carl and Ron, for coming on. We couldn't have done this without y'all. Thank y'all for y'all's insight and for everything that y'all have done for us tonight. Y'all are welcome back on any time to talk about any topic y'all want to. Um, I know we're going to be redoing our barbecue one, and Carl's going to be invited back for it.
You need to have me and Tom Strain on for that one, so we can argue about whose white sauce is better.
Well, and how do you feel about white sauce, Matt?
no, that's not barbecue sauce. I don't know who told y'all that, but it's not.
We're getting back to the barbecue discussion.
Yeah. So next week we'll start back on our Monday live streams. I cannot remember the topic. I think we're gonna do another historical one on Jeff Davis. I think that's what we had lined up. Does that sound right, Mr. Producer?
I think we had more of a relaxed one, and then we had Jefferson. But I'll have to look at the schedule we wrote down.
We should do Davis soon with the unveiling coming up at headquarters.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, we'll be back on next Monday at 8 o'clock. I appreciate again everybody who participated in the chat. Please, if you like the show, make sure to follow our channel. We usually go live every Monday around 8 o'clock. You can find us here. Until then, we're going to call it an episode here. And as usual, folks, remember, no Fumar in the elevator.
No Fumar in the elevator.
Elevator.